the internet has always been peer-to-peer. It's always been decentralized, or at least practiced minimum viable centralization. And when you think about the structure of email, for example, the fact that you and I can email each other even though we're using radically different products from different vendors or whatever, even though if we're not both on Gmail or whatever, right, that email is still able to work. It's gotten better over time, right? Email is a decentralized web technology, even though it doesn't have anything to do with the web and doesn't have anything to do with blockchain. There are a whole host of technologies, from distributed hash tables, DHTs, to distributed ledgers, to other kinds of distributed databases, key value pair kind of lookup systems that provide some of the referential integrity and transactional integrity that we expect from databases or from file systems that are much easier to do in a centralized way. But when you centralize it, you have questions of power and control and access and longevity that when you decentralize it, you can take a much different approach to.
Where are you launching your app? Like, where does your code live? Does it live on a server somewhere, or does it live on the blockchain? And if you build a smart contract, then you're actually using the blockchain itself as like where you're deploying your app. And so that's a version of Web3, of decentralized web. But there's really a lot of pieces there to decentralize. There's payments. Payments in the traditional web are, Stripe or whatever. Those are being routed through payment processors, credit card systems. Those are not being routed through blockchains currently. So payments is an area. Web content, that's something that Filecoin and IPFS are focused on, which is making it so I can deploy content on a decentralized hosting service, like a community of people and companies and people and companies and servers that are willing to store my content and share my content rather than me just using Amazon Web Services. There's domain names, and in the traditional internet world, you have a domain name, like you store it with GoDaddy. GoDaddy is your custodian. GoDaddy can make updates to the domain name. GoDaddy can actually transfer the domain name in theory without your permission. So they control it. And then in the decentralized web world, you would have a domain name, which is an NFT, an asset stored and controlled by the user that has this entirely different power structure.
There are many ways that something can be decentralized. An analogy I like to use is a character creator in a video game. You have so many points to allot to different stats. A protocol or open source project or product can decentralize in some ways, but it's probably doesn't have enough decentralization points to decentralize in every way that something could possibly be decentralized. And so to give some examples of that, we have, architectural decentralization. So the data is literally stored in different places. Or we have, decentralization of decision-making power about the protocol. So the protocol itself might actually store your data on a centralized server, but the decisions about what goes into it are governed by something like a DAO. Often there's this assumption in the peer-to-peer web community, the D-web community, that from architectural decentralization will follow decentralization of power. But if what we're actually interested in is decentralization of power, well, we should start there.
And from the more technical perspective, of course, it's super important to have unstoppable applications and censorship resistant, and that also is tied to decentralization and to trust minimization. But I don't think it's that much of a problem as, the different instances of gatekeeping and middleman that you suffer with centralized structures of power and technologies. In the end, the fact that there's people that can actually stop you for a reason or the other is, quite sorted for me. So that's where mainly my interest lies.
So when we talk about decentralization, I think people think it's like, spreading the power all around and throwing it far away into the distance. I think of it more like the power coming back to you, right? You are the people who are not in the center of Silicon Valley. You are the people who are not where we think of the heart of the internet is these days. And so decentralization is returning the power that people had at the very beginning of the internet back to where it belongs.
I think that for me, like the vision of where this would go is more and more people finding that the systems around them are well defined in a way that they can choose how they want to interact with the system. So to take another example, I use Twitter a lot. And let's say that I don't like the Twitter algorithm. I really wish that I could, for example, find all of the tweets that are people being angry about something and just really downregulate it. I don't need more anger coming at me through my computer screen right now. And so just tweets that are like creative, that are, exploratory, that are like positive, maybe those are the ones I'd like to see. If Twitter were an open protocol, then anyone in the world could come up with a new algorithm front end, being like the sort of like positive lens, like good vibes only filter. And I could choose to use that, to fork it, to turn it on for my Twitter. And that frankly would be better for my mental health. But because Twitter is centralized and they have unilateral control over how this algorithm will work, and they want to maximize engagement because that drives revenues.
I think with a centralized platform, you have a lot of centralized power and decision making and ability to impact people's economics. And in a decentralized platform where everyone is essentially an owner in it and everyone is an operator in it, it gives people economic upside and incentives to make sure that these decentralized infrastructures can be useful, and that's powerful. But I think maybe even more importantly, it gives people the feeling of a sense of control and a sense of ability to influence their own destiny and their own future, and the feeling that they're working towards something meaningful and they have the ability to influence that. And that's purpose, and that's mission, and that's what drives people and leads people not just to productive work and output, but ultimately to happiness and gratification with how they're spending so much of their time. And so I think that's a huge benefit of decentralization in Web3 that doesn't get nearly as much attention, but it really gives people a sense of purpose, motivation, and excitement to be part of something. And that's something that's hard to compete with from a centralized platform.
I think decentralization allows anyone with internet access to play and to engage in the game. I think that's unparalleled. Just to start, I think we often forget that, and we often, in the day-to-day, we go into so much more intricacies. But the main innovation here is that this is an internet native way to experience and collaborate with the world. It's not about status. It's not about access via, social status or education or anything like that. If you have access to internet and the right tools, you can find the right community to play in.
Decentralization was built into the structure of the internet and the World Wide Web in crucial ways. And yet over and over, when we attempt to embed decentralization into our technology, it reappears, centralization reappears in new forms, often in the economic control over that technology. So, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, thought that because of the way it was designed, large companies would never be able to control it. Of course, years later, that's precisely what's happened, and he has been kind of appalled at the kind of centralization that has ended up occurring with his invention. In the context of cryptocurrencies and blockchain, we see new forms of centralization emerging, things that people call whales or large mining pools, where systems that are in many ways decentralized by design in their technology are not necessarily decentralized in practice. And so we have to deal with this paradox that often when we create decentralized technologies, we actually create opportunities for new and even deeper forms of centralization. And we really have to wrestle with that paradox. I think we need to be more intentional about creating bulwarks against centralized power and creating accountable centralization in the midst of decentralized technologies.